Good morning. I am Saini at the University of Canberra, and I'm speaking with Michelle Grattan in our weekly conversation about politics in Australia. Good morning, Michelle.
Hello, Dave.
Nice to see you after 2 weeks. And these 2 weeks have been busy in the Parliament.
Certainly have.
Yeah, and Scott Morrison has been doing a lot of things, including the new strawberry contamination legislation. Now, is that something that's really necessary, or could it have been handled in other ways?
Well, certainly I think that the federal government, and Scott Morrison in particular, wanted to make a point that it was really a major issue and one that Canberra should be in. Now, I think probably the penalties for this offence, and it's a serious offence, are probably pretty adequate, frankly, mainly state legislation. But nevertheless, the federal government announced that there would be tough new penalties and a wider law to capture this sort of offence, and that was rushed through Parliament in an amazingly short time. One day it was through the House, through the Senate. As we know, of course, the Parliament usually works a lot more slowly than that. But before that, a whole array of figures were paraded. Even the Border Force Commissioner was out there talking about the problems. So the government was certainly not going to let this pass without a major presence.
Well, I mean, there are always speculations about motivations for that kind of speed, but let's leave that behind and talk about Scott Morrison in general. He's been revealing in many ways the kind of Prime Minister and a person he is. What, in your view, is starting to define him?
I think this desire to act, to be seen as someone who's doing things all the time, and the strawberry legislation illustrated this, but there are other examples too, and an important one, of course, was the announcement of the Royal Commission on Aged Care, and he jumped out with that announcement ahead of the ABC expose of problems and scandals in that sector. We saw also during the week the announcement of a big package on education for non-government schools, and that was to deal with a problem. So in general, he wants to be seen to be acting, and he wants to be seen to be tuned in to the sort of problems that ordinary people are concerned with. He contrasts that with the so-called Canberra bubble.
So encouraging, I'd say.
I think that his party are encouraged, his members are encouraged by what they see. Now, this isn't to downplay the fact that the government's still in a pretty parlous situation and there are divisions. But in general, they feel that Scott Morrison is tapping into community concerns and that he's cutting through.
Now, speaking of the divisions within the party, let's talk about Sudmalis, an MP who has said she would not run again, and she has accused the local MP of stacking and of bullying and so on. These are not first-time allegations. Others have said similar things, and they always seem to come from women. Does the Liberal Party still have the so-called women problem?
I think it certainly does, and for all the positives that colleagues are seeing from the new Prime Minister, they do realise that this really isn't being solved. Scott Morrison did say that he told the party organisation to set up a mechanism for complaints from MPs about bullying and bad behaviour. But beyond that immediate problem, there is of course the wider problem that the Liberal Party has so few women MPs, and there'll probably be several less after the election. There's no mechanism for encouraging more. Quotas have been rejected, and I think that this is an issue where Labor can score points because, of course, it has almost half its MPs women, and it'll be interesting too to see whether in the Wentworth by-election that theme comes through, because now we have a high-profile female independent who's really going to push the Liberals in that seat.
You alluded to some peace with the schools, and it's clear that you were referring to the Catholic school sector, where a very large package, $4.5 billion package, has been agreed to, and peace has been bought. Was this the right thing for the government to do? What are the implications of this for the wider education sector?
Well, I noticed today that the New South Wales Education Minister, and remember that's a Liberal government, has criticised the fact that this is somewhat of a distortion of the original policy announced by Malcolm Turnbull based on the Gonski needs-based model. But in political terms, I think that the government probably had no option but to try to buy off, and successfully buy off, I think, the Catholic sector, to get peace there. The sector had been running a strong campaign. We saw this in the Longman by-election, and would have continued to cause a lot of trouble, I think, right up until the election. So there are transition arrangements. It's a lot of money. Of course, it includes also money for the non-Catholic, non-government schools. It's not just the Catholic schools, but it's a political way through for the government.
Well, Michelle, let's leave Scott Morrison behind for a moment and speak about Peter Dutton, who has been caught up in this so-called au pair affair. There has been a Senate inquiry into that, and the inquiry has found that, contrary to his assertions that he did not know either of the prospective employers for these women, he in fact did have a connection with one of those families when he was a police officer. So he's accused now of misleading the Parliament. Where does that leave Peter Dutton's credibility?
Well, first let's say that this Senate inquiry was done by a committee that was dominated by Labor and the Greens. So we're always going to get a very negative report about Peter Dutton's activities in the visa affair. Having said that, I think it was clear when you look at the report, look at the evidence, that he did mislead Parliament. As you say, he did know one of these prospective employers, even if that acquaintanceship went back a very long time to when the two men were in the police force. But these days, misleading Parliament's not the offence it used to be. I remember once during the Labor years a minister resigned because he'd misled Parliament. Now Peter Dutton brushes it off, said, I didn't do it. Scott Morrison said he didn't do it, and things move on. However, I do think that a number of Peter Dutton's colleagues, a number of Liberal MPs, are thinking that they did dodge a bullet when Peter Dutton lost that leadership ballot. Because if he was now Prime Minister, you'd have this report, you'd have a lot of talk about his lack of credibility on this issue, you'd have the questions over his constitutional eligibility, and things would be not looking good at all for the government as it tries to recover. MPs are pretty glad, I think, that they've got Scott Morrison rather than Peter Dutton.
We keep longing for the good old days of politics when there was chivalry and honour, and it used to mean something.
Well, we probably romanticise them, but certainly on the question of misleading Parliament, standards have changed.
Standards do have changed indeed, yeah. Well, Michelle, thank you very much, and you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Steve.